Darwinian evolution was invented in a vacuum of knowledge, which is why if Darwin were alive today, he'd have a hard time being a Darwinist. When you look at biology, upon which evolution is based, it argues strongly against evolution. It's like a fractal. When you zoom up on it, you keep on zooming, you keep on getting more and more and more. That's what biology is like. Biology exemplifies the hand of an amazing creator. It's not Darwinistic simplicity. It's shocking complexity.
If Darwin were here today, what would you say to him? Charles Darwin's theories changed what the world believes about biological naturalism. His contributions to science are legendary, yet he knew nothing about the complexity of living things. I'm here with Dr. Robert Carter. You're a marine biologist and geneticist. You've studied Darwin's work, examined the Galapagos Islands firsthand, and have debated the origins of life with skeptics. If Darwin was still alive today, knowing what we know about living things, would he still be an evolutionist?
Well, that's an interesting question. There's actually a question that can be split, because one question is, would he still be an evolutionist? And the other one is, knowing what we know, would he invent evolutionary theory? Like if the whole world was creationist or something, would he dare? Would he be able to? That's very curious, especially considering that, in the 1800s, what they didn't know about biology? Almost nothing. Darwin was working in basically the dark ages of science. He didn't know about the complexity, didn't know about how things worked. He didn't know how things multiplied. He didn't know anything about genetics. And yet, what do we know about today about the cell? It's a wonder of complexity. It is unbelievably amazing. Everything we learn about it is shockingly complex. In fact, in some ways, scientific progress has been slowed down by the Darwinist insistence that life would be simple. Their just assumption that life would be simple. But time and time and time again, we find that something's a lot more complicated than anyone had anticipated. So would Darwin be an evolutionist today? Probably, but not a Darwinian evolutionist, as in he wouldn't be able to say, natural selection can be used to explain the complexity of all the things we see today. He'd probably be leaning toward one of the other things today, like neo-Darwinism or Darwin 2.0 that people are talking about, which I'm sure we're going to get into a little later.
What is it about common descent that led evolutionists in our time to depart from Charles Darwin's flavor of Darwinism?
Well, the original conception of Charles Darwin was that natural selection can explain the diversity of life. That was on hard times for many decades. But then in the early 1900s, they come up with the realization that mutations happen. They still didn't know what DNA, what its role was. They didn't know what a mutation was, but they knew that things could spontaneously change. And so that neo-Darwinism is bringing mutations into the fold. And now we can have, a new mutation might happen, and now natural selection can operate on it, and we can have progress. But in the modern concept, that's also weak. It doesn't explain everything, because how could you have incredibly complex cellular processes happen through just a random walk? How can you have a mutation, just an accident, produce something like photosynthesis or cellular respiration or cellular division or DNA maintenance? Most mutations tend to wear down the cell, not build up the cell. And so modern Darwinists are looking for alternates, new ideas. Maybe it's the patterns in the genes that specify body plans. If you just have a big mutation and rearrange those genes, maybe then you can have something with 4 legs or 6 legs or 2 legs, or maybe you can grow a spike or be bigger or smaller. But even then, those sorts of changes are usually detrimental. Like the first one they found a fruit fly that had legs instead of antenna. And well, that was a rearrangement of what are called Hox genes, these big genes that affect the body plans and basic patterning of living things. Maybe if we rearrange those, we can explain evolution. But when we rearrange those, we create monsters and we create deformed animals. We don't create improved versions. So they're still searching. That even though Darwinism is a thing of the past, and even though a lot of modern evolutionists, they don't want us to talk about Darwin. They want to say, Darwin's just some guy who lived in the past, 1800s. He has some ideas. But no, he's the man. He's the man who started off your entire intellectual framework here. So you can't neglect him. And when we talk about him, we realize what he didn't know Well, there's a lot we know today that contradicts basic Darwinist ideas. And that's why the creationists love to talk about Darwin and cellular complexity at the same time.
So then what are just like an overview of some of the various parts of the complexity of life that Darwin was mistaken about?
Well, it's really strange to think that the origin of evolutionary theory, they didn't know how genes transmit from one generation to the next. They didn't know anything about, meiosis or mitosis, or they didn't even know that genes were carried on DNA. That had to wait until like the 1940s and 1950s. We're talking about like almost 100 years later. So most of the early Darwinist mindset was done in ignorance. But just consider like, one protein. What does it take to manufacture a single simple protein? And the one I like to use as an example, let's use an example of a protein used in a little teeny molecular machine called ATP synthase. It's a beautiful motor. It's an electrically powered motor that's in all of our cells. It takes these two incredibly unexpected molecules. One's called adenosine diphosphate, which is highly reactive. You don't find it in nature anywhere. It has to be manufactured. And this ATP synthase will bond that to a phosphate, which is a molecule that's also very rare in nature, because phosphate, when it touches any metal, it'll form an insoluble salt and precipitates out a solution. So already we realize that DNA and RNA have a phosphate backbone. And the ATP, which is an energy storage thing for the cell, and most of our cellular processes are powered by ATP that's based on phosphates. That's a rare molecule. How did life even start with phosphate? That's another question. But we have this machine that's manufacturing these ATPs. And we're just going to talk about how to form one protein in that machine. Well, that protein has to be specified in DNA. But in order to have DNA, you need a lot of DNA repair systems, probably 200 or 300 different proteins involved in 20 or 30 different repair systems, because each type of mutation or break or oxidation or whatever might happen to DNA, each type of mutation has a different repair system. All those repair systems are based on proteins, which are coded in the genes of the DNA. So in order to have DNA, you need those repair systems already coded, and to make the proteins, you require a lot of ATP. So we want this ATP protein for the ATP synthase motor. It has to be coded in the DNA, and it's very expensive to maintain it. We haven't even made the protein yet, but we're using up a lot of ATP just to maintain it. And then the cell has to take the DNA, it's going to transcribe it into RNA. In our bodies, not in bacteria, they're more simple, but anything higher than bacteria, the genes have intervening spaces, and that RNA has to be cut out, and then the coding parts have to be joined together. That's energy intensive. That takes more proteins, which are coded in the DNA, which have to be maintained, which have to be transcribed, which have to be translated, which we haven't even talked about yet, and all that takes a fantastic amount of ATP. But once we have what's called our messenger RNA, that has to be translated into a protein. And the cell uses these little RNAs called transfer RNAs, which again are coded in the DNA, had to be transcribed, which uses a lot of ATP. But the transfer RNAs themselves, most of them are chemically modified 15, 20 times by other proteins that will cut this off, add something, do this, do that, do that. All those things are coded in the DNA. That requires a lot more ATP to make the transfer RNAs. But then we have a machine called a ribosome, which is a combination of proteins and RNAs, which again are coded in the DNA, transcribed for the RNA, translated for the proteins, modified, built. Well, that machine will slide down the transfer RNA, slide down the messenger RNA, take the transfer RNAs, 3 letters at a time, line them up, and at the top of the transfer RNA is an amino acid. And amino acids will be joined together in our protein. But we're not done yet. That's the protein we're going to use for our machine. No, not quite. Most proteins are modified after the fact. They're chemically changed or cut. Things are added to them. They have to be folded. And they're usually folded inside of another giant machine called a chaperonin. It's a multi-protein complex, and an unfolded protein goes in, it closes, it does the folding. If the thing doesn't fold correctly, it'll chop up and recycle the pieces somehow. We don't quite know how the thing works. Then out the other end pops a folded protein, which can then be chemically modified by other proteins, which have to be in the DNA, transcribed, translated, lots of AT being used. And then finally, we have that one component we asked for initially. And that component will be assembled into the ATP synthase motor. And now we can start manufacturing ATPs. Every single form of life uses that. We just burned a lot of ATP before we can even have the ATP synthase motor.
All right. So what you're describing sounds like a factory running inside of the cell.
Yes.
And that's just one factory inside of the cell. There's like many of these factories operating multiple processes
Yes.
and then sharing the material in unique ways. And just countless of them, there's many of them.
And every one of those processes has multiple levels of things that all have to work at the same time.
Right.
And they're mutually dependent on each level. So in this case, you probably heard of irreducible complexity. It's something the intelligent design people talk about, that Michael Behe in his book, Darwin's Black Box. Wonderful book, amazing thing. But this idea that if you had a system that you can't change the components or the system breaks, and he used a mousetrap as an example, a simple machine, you change the parts, you can't catch mice. It's irreducibly complex. Well, what I just described was something much more complicated than that.
Right.
I call it the spaghettification of irreducible complexity.
Yeah.
Because we have a system that is really hard to describe. And even though I took a long time to describe it, I skipped over most of the steps.
Yeah, that was just a part of it.
And I didn't use the big words that I could have used. And all that description just for one little piece that's required actually to maintain itself and all those levels of information, that's what Darwin had no idea about. Darwinian evolution was invented in a vacuum of knowledge.
All right, then so in Darwin's day, he wouldn't have known what science would figure out later.
Yeah.
But why did he create his theories in the first place? Why did he think that they were plausible during his time?
Oh, that's hard to say. He was raised in an environment that most people don't realize. Most people think, Victorian England and before that, that was very Christian. But his mother was a Unitarian. So she rejected the Trinity, which is one of the core doctrines of Christianity for the last 2,000 years. So she's already on the edge. His father and grandfather, they called themselves free thinkers. Now, the word agnostic and the word atheist, I don't think had been invented yet.
Okay.
So I'm not sure what they would call themselves today, but they called themselves free thinkers. His grandfather, who died before Charles Darwin was born, but his grandfather had wrote a book about evolution. It's called Zoonomia, but evolution
Wait,
wasn't.
his book was called Zoonomia?
Zoonomia, yes. Yeah. It wasn't popular yet, and it wasn't politically correct yet, so it wasn't a book, it was a book of poetry. Poetry about evolution. Darwin said that when he was a boy, he had committed entire passages of that book to memory. So he grew up in an evolutionary world. In fact, that the family coat of arms in the house that Darwin grew up, the carriage, all the book plates and the books in the library, there was a Latin phrase, e conscius omnia, all from shells.
Shells.
As in all life forms can be traced back to simpler life forms.
Okay.
That's straight up evolutionary theory there. What Darwin did is he took this evolutionary theory that was growing in popularity and he came up with a hypothesis that natural selection can be used to explain evolution. He didn't invent natural selection. He didn't invent evolution, but he brought them together to come up with the origin of species. He had several other influences in his life also. There was a man named Adam Sedgwick who was he's not a biblical creationist, but he was a Christian. We would call him an old earth catastrophist. He believed that a catastrophe happened at some point in Earth's history, and another catastrophe happened, maybe killed off the dinosaurs, and then another catastrophe. And that's why you have these distinct layers in the Earth's record. He is credited with naming one of the most important layers in the fossil record. It's called the Cambrian. This is when multicellular life is first diversifying. The Cambrian era, named after the ancient name for whales, Cambria. Well, Darwin, before his last year in university, he spent time with Sedgwick in Cambria, touring in Wales, looking at rocks. And so what he essentially gave Darwin was a falsifiable geology, because nobody believes what he was teaching then. And so he finishes up his last year, and he's picked to go on a voyage around the world, which took 5 years, on the famous HMS Beagle. And he gets on board the boat, and the Captain Fitzroy, a Christian, a future anti-Darwinist, hands Charles Darwin a brand new book, Lyell's Principles of Geology, the first volume. And Charles Lyell was a lawyer. He turned kind of like a geologist, a gentleman geologist maybe, and used all his lawyerly tricks to write this book about Earth's history. And he gave us phrases like, the present is the key to the past. And he would only appeal to slow and gradual. And he would only say, look around what we see today. That's the only thing you're allowed to apply to the fossil record. So you have slow processes, but no one believes Lyellian geology today either. He thought the continents slowly rose and slowly sank over millions of years, which is why you have seashells on top of continents. Well, today, geologists would say, no, plate tectonics has driven plates sideways, and that has caused buckling and rising of like mountains and things like that.
Right.
So totally different type of geology, but this is influencing Darwin. He needed millions of years. He needed deep time to come up with evolutionary theory.
And there was other ideas too, like cosmic evolution and chemical evolution, that Darwin didn't necessarily come up with. His was more about the origin and the tree of life for various species, right?
Yeah, it's really interesting because today you can't have biological evolution without chemical evolution. You can't have chemical evolution without cosmic evolution. But Darwin wrote, to speculate about the origin of matter, you might as well, or to speculate about the origin of life, you might as well speculate about the origin of matter. Well, wait a minute. The first one's called Big Bang, the origin of matter. Chemical evolution is the origin of life, and evolutionists, they will talk about these things, and one is dependent upon the other. You need a Big Bang and very improbable events to finally come up with an Earth-like planet that's in a perfect area where we're not getting fried by radiation from outer space, and we have a very stable sun, and we have just the right amount of gravity and just the right amount of all the components. And then you have to have somehow, and Darwin called it a warm little pond full of phosphoric salts and whatever, and you have to have just the right chemicals accumulating somewhere. And origin of life people have been struggling with this for decades. They cannot explain where life came from because they can't explain the warm little pond, where the chemicals come from. But then you get the chemicals. And the chemicals somehow have to form very complex chemicals, very improbable chemicals, and then they have to form the first living thing. In our Evolution's Achilles Heels documentary that we made several years ago, we captured Dr. John Sanford. He's one of my mentors in the faith, one of my mentors in science. I mean, a wonderful person. And he said something when we were interviewing him that really shocked me. And it took me a minute to realize. Once I realized what he was saying, I was like, wow. He says, I'll give the evolutionists anything they want. I'll give them all the chemicals they want. I'll give them proteins, RNAs, DNAs. I'll give them long chains of sugars. I'll give them cells. I'll even give them millions of years. And at this point, I'm thinking, he's giving away the farm. Yeah. What's left? And then he says, but they're nowhere close to explaining the origin of life, because life requires information. Life is essentially an information processing system. And information doesn't come from random chemicals, ever. If you want to have life, you need genes that say, do this under these circumstances, but don't do this under the other circumstances, because any living thing has to be able to make decisions. Even a bacterium has to choose which way it's going to swim, or whether it's going to open its pores or close its pores, depending upon the environment or what foods might be available. I mean, information processing and decision-making is inherent to all life, and you don't get information from randomness.
Right. A way that I would like to think of it is like you have a library, you have a system for the books, you got a librarian, you got bookshelves, and you've got books that even have letters in them, but no information, and nothing can cause that information to come from nowhere. Imagine
if we had 2 sheets of paper, and they're exactly identical in every respect. And on one piece of paper, maybe print out the 10 Commandments, or the Declaration of Independence, or John chapter 1, pick something. And the other piece of paper, we had the exact same letters, but they've been randomized. Mm-hmm. There is no physical test that you could do to show that these things are different. They look the same, they weigh the same, they have the same amount of ink, they have the same reflectance chemically, physically, they're exactly identical. But there's a big difference between them, isn't there? One of them, the letters have been arranged in a specific order that tells us something, and the other one, there's no information content. The only information content is there's no information on this page. The other page, it might be, do unto others as they do unto you, or whatever. It could be anything on this page, and we instantly recognize it as information, and we can instantly make decisions upon that. Well, same thing with life. Living things have DNA that contain genes, and the genes tell or inform or help the organism make decisions based on the information content. You could randomly scramble those letters on that page. You're not going to ever come out with the information that's required.
Right.
Ever, especially when you consider the simplest living thing has hundreds of genes and millions of letters, or at least hundreds of thousands of letters of DNA. Not going to happen randomly.
All right, so it's not as though Darwin's ideas were altogether original. You brought up how he had influences from his grandfather and others in his day. So why did he write The Origin of Species, and how was it received?
Wow. It is hard to put thoughts in someone else's mind. But his world, the people in his world were looking for something. They were looking for an antidote to the Christian ideas that were floating around. But yeah, in his book, there was nothing original. I mean, almost everything he wrote, someone else had already written. In fact, it was a disaster of citation. In edition after edition after edition, he kept on adding, oh yeah, this person said that, this person said this, I got this idea from here. And there was really nothing original there. He didn't even invent the phrase natural selection or the idea of natural selection, but he put it all together in a book. And basically, in Victorian society, he was a rich man who was famous and well-educated, and those sorts of people did all the important things in a society. So when Alfred Russel Wallace wrote an essay from the South Pacific Islands that was essentially identical to Darwin's thesis, that natural selection can lead to diversification over time and evolution. And he sent it to Darwin to publish it. And Darwin said, uh-oh, I've been scooped. And in science, the person who publishes first, they get priority. We should call it Wallacean evolution. It doesn't roll off the tongue very nicely.
Right.
But he hadn't yet published it. He sent it to Darwin for review. So Darwin and his friends encouraged him to really quick write an essay. And they read both papers on the same day at some big society in England, and then forgot about Wallace from there on out. Because now we call it Darwinian evolution. So things are happening, right? The world is getting more and more away from a biblical explanation. I mean, they'd already accepted millions of years in most of the geologists. And there's some people who absolutely refuse to go that way. There are scriptural geologists all over the place, scriptural biologists, but we don't hear about them because they lost the battle in the 1800s. So most people don't even know who was fighting the good fight back then. And one thing that Darwin promised his friends was he was going to write a sequel to The Origin of Species. The Origin of Species just put forth a hypothesis. The second book was going to be all the evidence for evolution.
I think that's kind of important.
Yes, well, he never finished that manuscript because he couldn't. It was in his study when he died. He worked on it, but he could not write it because he couldn't find evidence for evolution. See, from the creationist perspective, natural selection is not a threat. Once you have living things, once God creates living things with variation and the potential for mutation, especially after the fall, you can get changes that might influence survival. Whoop-de-doo. That's not proof of common ancestry. That's just proof that things can change and adjust over time.
Right.
So he needed something more, and he couldn't find it. And that debate is still with us today, 150 or more years later.
I want to take a closer look at the biological complexity subject. But before we do, is there anything else that you wanted to mention about Darwin's mistakes? Anything else before we look at that one?
Oh, man. Darwin was a man of his times. Think of the middle of the 1800s, what was happening. There were the scientific study of bumps on people's heads. It was called phrenology. And they claimed that you could tell personality and traits based on just the bumps on your head, which is nonsense. We had Freud and his psychology that everyone's rejected today, but it was super popular. We had seances all over the place. I mean, Darwin even went to a seance just to see what it was about. We had the spiritism idea that you could communicate with the spirit world. We had the rise of all these different cults. I mean, the world was basically reeling because we had established the laws of science for several hundred years now, and now they're trying to science everything. The science of communicating with the spirit world. What? And they're trying to science everything. And so Darwin was trying to come up with a law of biology based on his ignorance of biology. He didn't know anything about what we know today. And his attempt was a dismal failure because natural selection doesn't explain anything. So even later on in several other books that he wrote, like The Descent of Man, he said, I put too much stock in natural selection. And then he says, oh, maybe it's group selection, kin selection, which are things that evolutionists argue about stridently today. That's very hard to define, very hard to prove. Mm-hmm. So selection, even in Darwin's mind, wasn't working. He was trying for something else. So if he were alive today and he knew what we knew about the cell,
wow,
it would be a different situation entirely.
Right. So you mentioned a little bit ago that you were involved in a film about Darwinism or evolution, and you've also been to the Galapagos Islands for another film. You want to tell us a little bit about those?
Oh, that was a fun project. We did something in honor of Charles Darwin's 200th birthday. It was also the 150th anniversary of the origin of species. We went around the world tracing his footsteps, and we put together a movie we called Darwin, the Voyage Shook the World. And I got to go to the Galapagos Islands. And it was a wonderful trip. I got to see the giant tortoises. I got to see the iguanas. I got to see the finches, all the things that Darwin saw. In fact, we went to the giant tortoise breeding facility on one of the islands, and they were trying to captively breed some of the really rare giant tortoises that Darwin wrote about. And there was one of them that was just one male left of the whole species, just one male. And I asked the director, I said, what's going to happen to this species? He goes, oh, we're going to breed that one with this other species over here. I said, the species are interfertile? He goes, oh, yeah. And so I was thinking to myself, what's a species?
Right.
And if species can reproduce together, that's basically the biological species definition. If two things can reproduce, they're only one species. But because they're separate islands, and because the turtles have a hard time swimming between the islands, each island has its own little population. And so genetic drift and mutations have happened, and you can actually tell the difference between the islands. In fact, each one of the major volcanoes on the islands has a different species of tortoise. Darwin wrote, the governor of these islands tells me, I'm going to paraphrase here, tells me that he can tell the difference between the tortoises just based on the shape of the shell, from which island they came from, just based on the shape of the shell. And he writes, I did not sufficiently pay attention to this. In other words, he didn't believe him. He was not thinking evolution on the Galapagos Islands. So there's an urban myth that Darwin invented evolution while visiting the Galapagos Islands. That's not true. It was years later. And he's trying to fix the historical record. Oh, yeah, he told me about it, a vague thing in the back of my head. No, he didn't believe him, that the different tortoises on different islands would look different. In fact, when Darwin collected his finch samples, his famous, the Darwin's finches, we call them, right? He collected all these birds in these islands, and he neglected to write which island he collected them from.
Because he wasn't thinking about the species on the various islands.
He said he never imagined that the species on such similar islands would be dissimilar.
Yeah.
He was not thinking this way yet. And so what they did was, after he sent these samples back to London for the taxonomist to work out at the museum, they said, hey, Darwin, there's a problem. Where'd you get them from? They actually used Captain Fitzroy, remember the Christian, the future anti-Darwinist? They used his collection of finches to sort out Darwin's collection of finches so that we can call them Darwin's finches. So he was not a careful scientist at all. In fact, he wasn't even a scientist. At best, he was a philosopher, and he wasn't a very good philosopher. Darwin never did a controlled scientific experiment his entire life.
Wow.
He did one amazing experiment, though. He took seeds with a friend, and they soaked seeds in salt water for months, sometimes up to a year. And then they planted them to see which ones would sprout. And most of them sprouted. And I'm like, thank you, Mr. Darwin, for telling us that seeds can survive Noah's flood.
Why were they doing that experiment?
He might have been trying to see how seeds could get to the Galapagos, because they have to float out into the ocean. I was actually sitting in an airplane next to a very famous evolutionist. I won't mention her name. Very famous evolutionist on a flight to the Galapagos Islands. And she said, we had just met, we'd become friends, we're talking. I said, I was a big fan of her work. And she goes, oh, look out the window. And so as we're taking off from Guayaquil Airport in Ecuador, I'm looking at the Guayaquil River. And she said, do you see any floating vegetation mats? I said, yeah, I see some big clusters of branches and things. She goes, sometimes those things can get to a mile across. And they can float out to sea and carry animals and plants and even pockets of fresh water with them. And they can disperse across the ocean, who knows where. And I said to myself, well, thank you for telling us about the creationist model of post-flood biogeography.
Wow. So you met her while you were traveling to the Galapagos for the film?
For the film, yes. We asked them if we could interview them, but they declined, her and her husband.
Okay.
Very sad. But it was an opportunity that I got to talk to them, and it was amazing. But so Darwin's doing these seed studies, and he doesn't do a control. He doesn't soak some in fresh water, or he doesn't not soak any at all. So when he says, X% germinated after a year in salt water, well, how much would have germinated without the year in salt water? We don't know. So he's not an experimentalist. He's a theoretician. And he's doing philosophical work in the origin of species. It's not really science. It's really hypothesis-driven without empirical testing, which is why he failed when he tried to write his book about it. He tried to write a book that proved evolution, and he couldn't do it because he's not a scientist, and the evidence for evolution wasn't there after all.
So all of this and a whole lot more was packed into the documentary about Charles Darwin?
Yeah, Darwin, the Voyage shook the world. What a fun project. What an amazing opportunity to be involved in something like that.
So if you want to check out the Darwin, the Voyage that shook the world, you just need to get to the link that is in the description with this YouTube video. So back to the complexity of life.
Okay.
Do you think that it could have evolved?
There's no way. Life is utterly complex. The more we look at life, the more complex it becomes. Darwinian evolution is couched upon the assumption that life was simple. He had this idea that there was protoplasm in the cell. Not cytoplasm, what we call it, protoplasm, almost like a life force that was, forcing things to change. It was kind of weird. In fact, one of his good friends and another associate were involved in a major scientific fraud about this time. The thought that there was a protoplasm, a germ sort of a thing inside the cells, led them off into la-la land. Thomas Huxley was also called Darwin's bulldog. He was looking at some sediment samples that had been collected in a deep sea drilling project some years prior. And he saw that on the top of the sediment in the salt water, there was a layer of goo. And he said, oh, that's the protoplasm. The oceans are covered, the ocean floors are covered in this gooey acellular stuff where life is just spontaneously forming all over the place. See, evolution is possible because life is continually arising from this goo.
Out of the primordial soup that we find in bodies of water.
That didn't exist, but he claimed it did. So Ernst Haeckel, who Russell Grigg called him the apostle of deceit, he is possibly the most lyingest scientist of all time. The guy made stuff up in favor of evolutionary theory in a lot of different ways. He was also a horrible, abhorrent racist, but that's another subject. He starts studying this stuff, and he wrote this multiple-page paper in a world-famous journal that describes it. He even gave it a scientific name, Bathybius Huxleyi. So Huxley was pleased. And so here's two people really important to early Darwinism completely lying about something. What was figured out pretty soon afterwards, even though these two guys took years to make any sort of retraction. One of them was a really weak retraction. But very soon afterwards, they realized, no, that goo was just a precipitate of the salt water. When you add alcohol to salt water, some of the minerals will precipitate out and make this amorphous whitish goo. And that's all it was a chemical reaction.
Yeah.
But they went off, into la-la land talking about this, and a lot of people said, oh, evolution must be true. Evolution must be simple. Life is not complicated. Life is just kind of based on goo. And so if you want to imagine that a cell grows a spike or turns purple or becomes a square or a circle, it's easy if, first of all, there's some life force behind it. And second of all, if it's really simple. If you don't know what is behind the change, you can imagine anything. So when Darwin said, I see no limit to the amount of change that natural selection could produce, well, he didn't know the mechanism behind it. Of course, he can see no limit. He didn't know the details. We know the details today, which is why if Darwin were alive today, he'd have a hard time being a Darwinist.
Well, and a lot of the evolutionists today don't even want the origin of life to be part of the theory, right?
Yes. That's origin of life. That's not evolution. Oh, hold it. You need an origin of life theory. First of all, you've called it chemical evolution for decades. All of a sudden, you don't want to call it that anymore. But they need an origin of life. Because if they don't have an origin of life, then where'd life start? Is there a God who started life? Or maybe it was aliens. Well, that's not helpful. That's still intelligent design. And you don't want to say that that the universe is alive, sort of like a Gaia or maybe a Buddhist sort of philosophy. That's too metaphysical. That's not.
It doesn't sound scientific at all.
It doesn't sound scientific at all. And so they need an origin of life, and we're not going to let them off the hook that easily by them just trying to say, "Oh, we don't worried about chemical evolution." Not true. They're very worried about it.
Okay. So growing up, I remember seeing the evolutionary tree of life and all the branches off. Was that one of Charles' own inventions?
As far as I know, the earliest tree of life depiction comes from one of Darwin's notebooks.
The reason I bring it up is because it just makes it look so straightforward.
Oh, yes. All life evolving, all the branches going back to very simple organisms. He wrote in 1830s, a notebook. He wrote, "I think." And he wrote a branching diagram with extinct species and a live species branching backwards into a common root. So today we call that the tree of life. It is not true. It has been destroyed by modern genetics. We expected, or say Darwinists expected, that at the base of the tree of life, which would be bacteria, there should be a common root. Everything should collapse into the last universal common ancestor called Luca. But it didn't happen. What happened was when we started sequencing the genomes of all these different bacteria, we found almost a random pattern of genes. There wasn't a clear path. It was like these bacteria had something and someone over there had the same thing, and some other totally unrelated thing had that also. But this other gene or gene complex, these other random arrangements of bacteria, it's like when God made bacteria, he scrambled all the genes amongst them to thwart all the naturalist explanations. Or the evolutionists would say, "Oh no, it's horizontal gene transfer." They came up with an ad hoc explanation that early life forms would have shared their genes, and so when they finally speciated and started separating to different branches of the bacterial world, they ended up with random collections of those early genes.
Okay.
Not what they expected, but they came up with an ad hoc explanation, which they've done many other times also.
And does that theory of theirs, ad hoc, still work?
It's an explanation.
Okay.
I think a much better explanation is that there is a designer.
Okay.
In fact, it's a cellular complexity that compels me to believe in a designer.
Okay, well, that was so important. Can you explain that and unpack that for us?
If life were really simple, life could change. Life might be able to evolve even, but it's super complicated. It's abundantly complicated. It's just breathing complexity. Every time you look at life, and the more you look at it, the more complex it becomes, and the less tenable evolutionary theory is. So it doesn't even matter how similar humans and chimpanzees are. Who cares? It's the complexity of the cell that boggles the mind, and the origin of life that says, no, it's not going to happen. And then we find, like, you go back to the tree of life again, we find way radical branches of the supposed tree of life that can supposedly reproduce. They found a hybrid between a sturgeon and a paddlefish a couple of years ago. Those things have been supposedly separated for a couple 100 million years. I don't remember the exact number, but it's a very long time. These are ancient lineages of fish, and they produce babies? How is that possible? How can they still possibly be interfertile after that much time? I mean, you think of all the things that supposedly evolved in that time.
Yeah.
I mean, the radical, that's before the dinosaurs. I mean,
that's been a really long time.
Yeah, in the evolutionary model, that's a long time ago. So we're finding all these contradictions to the tree of life idea is telling us the tree of life idea is actually false.
This has been really good. So to sum up everything that you've been saying, what exactly is the problem for the complexity of life and Charles Darwin?
Oh, there's so many aspects to consider. Well, first of all, you need cosmic evolution to produce a radically improbable planet. And then you need chemical evolution to produce radically improbable molecules and arrange them in such a way that it can't happen by chance. And after all that happens, Then you need biological evolution, and yet we know that the cell is so radically complex that it's not going to be able to change much, and it's not going to evolve in the first place, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Natural selection is irrelevant because the creationists believe in natural selection. So natural selection is not a proof of evolution. It doesn't prove anything at all. It just means that, things can change. Okay, some things reproduce better than others depending on the environment. Okay, that's fine. So what's evolution got left? They're faced with this wall of complexity, a wall of incomprehensibility. I mean, biology is really complicated, and it's sometimes overwhelming when you start digging into the details. I mean, how many students of biology failed because they couldn't memorize all the list of names, even in high school? Now get into the PhD level beyond that, and the names never stop. The functions never stop. The little intricacies of detail. It's like a fractal. You ever see one of those, the Mandelbrot set, when you zoom up on it and you keep on zooming and you keep on getting more and more and more?
Yeah.
That's what biology is like. Biology exemplifies the hand of an amazing creator. It's not Darwinistic simplicity. It's shocking complexity.
Right.
That's the heart of the issue.
All right. So I just have one more fun question for you.
Okay.
If Darwin were here today, what would you say to him?
I'd say, Charles, open your eyes. Look at biology. Look at the exquisite complexity. Look at the elegance and the beauty that's inherent in all life forms. You're telling me that this happened by chance? Then you believe in bigger miracles than I do. You believe in the ridiculously sublime, incredibly not going to happen given a gazillion years probability stuff. And I have a reason for life existing. I have a God outside who's imbuing life with his genius. And we see it everywhere we turn. Living things are a testament to the God of creation, not to whatever form of random chance that you want to appeal to. It's a gospel issue. I mean, Darwin, as far as we know, he never understood basic Christian principles. Even though he went to study to be a country vicar, he went to Cambridge to become a priest. In his education, he never had to open the Bible.
Wow.
How
could you do that?
In all of his writings, he never showed an understanding of basic Christianity. It wasn't even part of his upbringing or the friends he was associated with. And no, he never recanted on his deathbed. That's another urban myth. No, to the end of his life, he became more and more and more of an atheist. And he wrote that it never caused him any distress. He died a bitter, miserable, physically suffering, conflicted old man. I mean, he didn't even go to his favorite daughter's funeral. Annie died when she was 10 years old. He couldn't get himself to the church to go to a funeral. I mean, what kind of a person? That's just, it's sad.
Yeah.
And he had no hope. And he had brought himself out of any thought that there might be a God, that there might be a creator, that there might be someone who cares for him. And Darwinian evolution for him was the end. And for so many other people, I mean, they're hopeless. They don't see that there is this creator, and this creator actually loves them. And this creator actually has a relationship with people. And he's given us a record of the events on earth that led to Jesus Christ paying that penalty that we deserve, that you learn in Sunday school sort of stuff. Evolution is one of the greatest excuses of people to become atheists. And yet, when you look at biology, upon which evolution is based, it argues strongly against evolution.
So if somebody's watching this and they are being discouraged by a nihilistic worldview, what would you say to them?
I would say the same thing that I would say to Charles Darwin. Look at life. Look at the beauty, the complexity, the technology. This didn't arise by chance. And yet nihilism, the evolutionary mindset, drives people to purposelessness, indifference. There's no reason for being alive. There's no, you're just cosmic stardust that just happened to come together for a temporary time, and then you're going to poof out of existence. But what if it's not true? I mean, the design of the cell tells us that there was a designer. If there's a designer, then none of that, what I just said, is true. There must be something else. There is hope. Just look to heaven. Look to this God of creation. Dig in, find someone who's a Christian, start asking the questions, start reading the Bible. Now, don't go on YouTube because, man, you type in anything about the Bible on YouTube, you get all these anti-Bible people will pile up. But there are good sources of information. Creation.com is a great source. Probably your pastor at church is a great source. Maybe grandma is a Bible believer. Ask her why she believes stuff and just start talking about it. There is hope in this world that's not given to us through the Darwinian science establishment. And I love pointing people toward that and actually using biology to preach the gospel.
Wow, this has been a wonderful conversation, Rob. And a lot of this came from the film that you were a part of. So do you want to go back to that and tell us a little bit more about the film?
It's really funny that we made this hour-long documentary in life of Charles Darwin called The Voyage That Shook the World. And so many evolutionists don't want us to talk about Charles Darwin. But look what happened when we did. We just had a long conversation of all these interesting facts of Darwin's life, about science, about biology, about philosophy, religion. I mean, it spiders down to all these really interesting directions, but we didn't nearly cover everything that could be said. So documentary, we interviewed multiple people, creationists, evolutionists. We traveled around the world, going different places to his home. We went to Galapagos, up and down South America. And we were actually the first people ever to bring a high-def camera to the Galapagos.
Wow.
That was the technology at the time, and we were first. In fact, National Geographic rented the same ship we rented the week after us.
Nice.
And so we did the top quality as best we could, a documentary on the man, because if you want to understand evolution, you got to understand Darwin. And he's not the person most people think. And there's so much nuance and so much interesting, subtle details and some sad things also about his life that if we understand him better, we can understand much better the creation-evolution debate today.
Fantastic. Now, if you're interested in the documentary film, for the first time ever, it is being made available for free. So if you want to click that link in the description with this episode, you can see it as well. Dr. Carter, thank you so much for your time.
Joe, it's been my pleasure.